Pirates, gangsters, villains, and the worst of humanity swallowed up by the sea. But why? Were they ripe for the wrath of God? Or are there deadly natural forces at work? What if you could drain the ocean to reveal the secrets of the seafloor? Now, powerful new technology can do just that. Digital photos and sonar scans give us remarkable new insights into a world beneath the sea. What apocalyptic disaster wiped out the pirate city of Port Royal?
It's a city that was literally swallowed by the sea.
And what are the dangerous forces that made Alcatraz, the Rock, the most infamous prison on Earth?
The conditions surrounding this island is what really made it an escape-proof prison.
Drained dry, we reveal the extreme geological forces that led to the demise of so much wickedness. Deep beneath the waves is a reminder of the Earth's violent beginning. Through the use of cutting-edge technology, we can reveal the secrets of the sea floor in astonishing detail and expose the shaky ground on which we all live. In the 17th century, Port Royal, on the south coast of Jamaica, was an English stronghold at the heart of the Spanish Empire, dominating what would become Kingston Harbor from the end of a long spit of land.
If you've seen the Pirates of the Caribbean movie, the first town you go to where we meet Jack Sparrow is Port Royal.
Grown fat on the profits of piracy and slavery, Port Royal was a city of almost 8,000, the ultimate boom town of a new world. But it was also known as the wickedest city on Earth. It certainly had more bars and brothels than any other city in the whole of the English colonies.
For the port indeed is very loose in itself. 'Tis now more rude than e'er was Sodom, filled with all manner of debauchery.
On June 7th, 1692, disaster struck Port Royal. A massive earthquake wiped 2/3 of the city off the map, sending it to the bottom of the sea. Today, archaeologist John Henderson, an expert in sunken cities, will use new technology to discover just how the disaster unfolded. Port Royal sank so fast that it took its secrets with it.
This is a true sunken city, but not only that, it's a catastrophic site. It went down so quickly that it sealed a moment in time. It's sometimes called the Pompeii of the New World. It's now underwater for us to discover, and that's really rare in archaeology.
John's mission is to rediscover the sunken city and recreate a precise digital model of its ruins. Data that explains how the city tore apart in 2 minutes of terror. It's a huge challenge, but if it works, we can virtually drain the ocean, strip away millions of gallons of water, and bring the sunken city of Port Royal back into the light of day. Draining the sea beyond Port Royal may explain why it became a pirate powerhouse. It's all down to its location, right at the entrance of Kingston Harbor. Pulling the plug on these Caribbean waters reveals one of the largest natural harbors. At 10 miles long and 2 miles wide, it's large enough to shelter hundreds of ships from the hurricane-whipped tropical seas. Better still was the long finger of land on which Port Royal was built.
One of the things we'll see is the spit coming out into this very deep harbour.
Its steep sides made it the perfect location to dock ships.
You had deep water on either side. Large ships could come up and get very close to the shore very quickly.
This might seem like an ideal spot to build a port, but made of constantly shifting sand, the Spit would be Port Royal's undoing.
The main problem is there is no solid geology down there for a very long way. So in an earthquake, when that starts to shake, you're in trouble.
I very much doubt that anybody in Port Royal realised they were sitting on a time bomb.
John Henderson is here with photographer Simon Brown to photograph the sunken city. With bad underwater visibility, Simon must get as close as possible to the ruins and take thousands of images. After 3 days, the many photos have been compiled into a 3D representation of what lies on the seabed.
Okay, Simon, show me what we've got then.
It's not been easy, but we've captured quite a lot of Building 5.
Building 5 may once have been a grand family home. All that remains of it now is one room, showing up in unprecedented detail.
I mean, this looks fantastic, given the conditions you were working in. I mean, we can see they've got the wall, you can actually see the courtyard next to it, you can see the fire pit, you can see the low walls. This is great, we can actually see the individual bricks themselves. For me, what's exciting is you can show that to someone and they can instantly see what's actually down there. I didn't think you would get results as good as this.
John's mission is delivering spectacular results.
We're beginning to reconstruct, for the first time in 300 years, really, what exactly is there.
Now we can examine the most famous pirate city from every angle and shine light on the extraordinary disaster that sent thousands of people and hundreds of houses to the depths. But clues to its wickedness still lie hidden in darkness. Since the 1950s, 3 archaeology expeditions have sifted Port Royal's underwater ruins to uncover its pirate past. And in the 1980s, a team discovered part of the fabric of the city itself.
During that 10 years, we excavated 5 buildings pretty much completely. It was the most exciting excavation I've ever conducted.
Today, we use science to map these discoveries right across the sunken city. Thousands of relics from a lost world, all clues to Port Royal's cataclysmic final day.
Because this is a catastrophic site, it sealed a whole range of goods that were being used at a particular moment in time.
Each one is an insight into the 17th century world of Caribbean pirates.
So we can get actual snapshots and glimpses into daily life.
From pewter tableware to Chinese porcelain and signs of personal wealth.
The archaeological record at Port Royal shows how quite rich it was, because usually towns in the New World are impoverished copies of those in Europe, whereas Port Royal actually stacks up against the capitals of Europe.
But how did Port Royal grow so rich? The city was built from the wealth of stolen Spanish treasure. In the 1650s, England and Spain were at war. Jamaica, an English territory in the Caribbean, lay surrounded on all sides by the Spanish Main, from Florida through Mexico and South America. To gain the upper hand over the Spanish, the English enlisted the help of pirates.
In 1657, the Lieutenant Governor of Port Royal actually invited the pirates to come here and to act as a kind of unofficial defense force.
To the English government, pirates who attack Spanish goods and bring them to English ports could be an asset.
pirates were licensed to raid the Spanish, at sea or on land. They became known as buccaneers or privateers.
What happens in Port Royal really is state-sanctioned piracy.
And in Port Royal, at the heart of the Caribbean, the buccaneers were perfectly placed, in striking distance of the main shipping routes between the New World and Europe.
If the Spanish are going to try and get anything home, they have to get it past Port Royal. So it's rather like a fox sitting in the middle of a chicken coop full of chickens.
Port Royal became the buccaneering capital of the world. By agreement, the English crown took a quarter of the plunder. The rest was shared amongst the pirates.
On one of the very first buccaneering expeditions, 1659, the fleet brought back the modern equivalent of 75 million US dollars. The Spanish wealth that hits Port Royal in periodic waves is colossal.
Massive injections of cash transformed this fortified outpost into a boom town. The drained city exposes as many as 2,000 brick and timber houses, crammed into Port Royal streets. Home to a growing population of almost 8,000. The crowded, narrow streets would become a death trap when the earthquake struck.
We're on a very enclosed, very overcrowded peninsula. We've got people living here side by side in 2 to 4 story dwellings. When the earthquake struck, there was nowhere to run.
From the thousands of clues uncovered from Port Royal's seabed, there is one chilling piece of evidence of when the earthquake struck. A 17th century pocket watch. Its hands long since rusted in the sea. But closer analysis of the find reveals something intriguing.
When it was x-rayed, it was seen that the hands had actually stopped at 11:43. Now, we know from the historical records that the earthquake apparently hit just before noon. And this has been taken by some to say that the hands of that watch stopped exactly when the earthquake struck.
But what powerful natural forces set the earthquake in motion? To find the answer, we're draining the ocean, not just from Port Royal, but from the whole of Jamaica, to uncover the source of the earthquake. Hidden in darkness, thousands of feet beneath the water.
As you drain the ocean from around Jamaica, what you see is these giant furrows in the seabed. They're fracture lines running east-west. And they're faults. They're earthquake fault lines.
The faults form part of the boundary between two pieces of the Earth's crust, the North American plate and the Caribbean plate to the south. Both constantly on the move.
It's a place where the gradual motions of the plate either side get snagged, stress builds up. Essentially, it's an earthquake zone.
And Port Royal sits right in the middle of it.
And in the case of 1692, that stress that had built up very, very gradually over time gets unleashed into this huge earthquake.
As the stress in the Earth's crust is released, it propels a powerful seismic wave into the surroundings. June 7th, 1692.
Doomsday at Port Royal begins like any other day. There are daily prayers in the churches, business begins at sunrise.
People were just going about their business.
Traveling up to 5 miles per second, the seismic pulse was heading straight for Port Royal.
There's records of one guy about to go and have sherry with the Lieutenant Governor that morning. There was no indication of what was about to come.
Port Royal's alleyways and buildings were full of people, its wharfs and docks crowded with merchant ships.
I think the first indication we've got is a bang of noise in the north, in the mountains, and a kind of low rumbling.
Well, the records we have suggest there was 3 pulses from the earthquake.
It was what's to come that was the real killer.
For the shake was so violent that it threw people down on their knees.
Chasms opened up in the ground.
We felt the house shake and saw the bricks begin to rise in the floor. The ground heaved and swelled like a rolling, swelling sea.
People ran for their lives from the falling masonry. But the city offered no refuge.
Port Royal was almost the worst case scenario. Really tall buildings made of brick with narrow streets. So if you're in those streets, it's almost impossible. Your choice of whether to stay in a building and to get in the street it's a lottery.
The earthquake was just the beginning. It alone doesn't explain how Port Royal plunged into the sea. It would sink for an entirely different reason. Scientists call it liquefaction. For the people of Port Royal, it was hell on earth. The sandy ground where they built their houses turned into a deadly quagmire.
So what happens with liquefaction is you've got sand with lots of water in it, and as you shake it, it turns into a slurry. It liquefies.
Rarely captured on camera, this footage reveals the horrors of liquefaction at work in Niigata, Japan, on June 16, 1964. The energy from a massive earthquake separated the grains of sediment below the city, allowing water to rush to the surface. Earth turned to quicksand, sucking the city down. The unlucky people of Port Royal wouldn't have known how solid land can become liquid death. Minutes into the earthquake, the second catastrophe unfolded. As the ground sheared open, water and sand erupted from it. The longer the ground shook, the more liquid the sand became. Grand houses, churches, taverns, and even Port Royal's forts sank like stones.
Those houses, which but just now appeared the fairest and loftiest in these parts, were in a moment sunk down into the earth, and nothing was to be seen of them.
Some people were trapped, half in the sand and half out.
The earth received up to their necks, and then closed upon them, squeezing them to death with their heads above ground, many of which the dogs eat.
Many perished in this quicksand, but there is one incredible story of survival. A French merchant, Louis Galdi, found himself sucked into the ground.
Everyone thought he was dead, and then in the succeeding shock, he was spat out into the sea, and he survived by swimming to the nearest boat, after which he became a really religious man.
In all, 2/3 of Port Royal sank, taking with it 2,000 souls and hundreds of buildings. It's reported that the city took only minutes to disappear into the sea. But the chaos that the earthquake had unleashed wasn't over. On the drained, lost city, we can reveal extraordinary evidence that the earthquake delivered one last shock to Port Royal. Embedded in the seafloor are the skeletal remains of a large ship. She lies right amongst the ruins of a house on Lime Street.
Well, the clear question is, why is there a ship sitting on the floor of a building in Port Royal?
The strange discovery was excavated in the 1980s by Donnie Hamilton. Now John wants to find out exactly what it tells us about Port Royal's day of doom.
What we see here is a plan view of Building 5 and Building 4. We came across a timber which turned out to be the keel of a ship.
But how could a ship, presumably in harbor, crash into a house in the middle of town? Would the identity of the stricken ship solve the mystery? When Donnie's team searched the records, they revealed a possible contender. An English warship measuring 74 feet long. Similar to this ship, she was called HMS Swan.
We knew from the records that the Swan was in the harbor at the time of the earthquake, and it fits the basic dimensions of the ship that we found in Building 4.
It turned out that on June 7th, 1692, HMS Swan was being serviced at Port Royal's wharfs. All clues point to one conclusion.
You have a ship that would have been sitting in the harbour, a good 200 feet away from this building, has now been deposited, launched actually on top of it. I mean, it's quite clearly evidence of a tsunami.
The tsunami was the third cataclysm to hit Port Royal. One eyewitness account tells of the sea retreating from Kingston Harbor before the wave hit. It was a wave similar to the tsunamis that devastated Japan in 2011 and Thailand in 2004. The tsunami would explain what happened to HMS Swan. Empty of ballast, HMS Swan was like a cork on the mighty wave that crashed over Port Royal. She was hurled across the drowned city, washed down Queen Street, finally crashing into a house on Lime Street, piercing its walls with considerable force. The archaeologists have mapped the fate of Port Royal. Port Royal was laid to waste by an earthquake, quicksand, and tsunami waves. The disaster left the city cut off from the mainland. All that remained was a devastated island and thousands of dead bodies.
A multitude of whose corpses floated a great many days after from one side of the harbour to the other, caused such an intolerable stench that the dead were like to destroy the living.
When news of the disaster arrived in Europe, it seemed that God had finally delivered his judgment on the wicked pirate city.
When the news reaches the home country, there's quite a widespread feeling that the wickedest city in the English-speaking world has just got its just desserts.
So it was seen as divine retribution. It was seen as just punishment for the lewd and terrible behaviour that took place in Port Royal.
By this terrible judgment, God will make them reform their lives, for there was not a more ungodly people on the face of the earth.
Port Royal never recovered its former glory. The trading jewel of the Caribbean was wiped off the face of the earth.
It's interesting to think if the earthquake hadn't actually struck here, that this place could have developed somewhere like Manhattan or somewhere like Hong Kong.
But in the end, it was Port Royal's lethal location on an active fault zone and deadly quicksand that sealed its fate. Half a world away, California lies on one of the most infamous fault zones in the world. And right offshore is an island that might just be the safest place when the next big one hits. Alcatraz, The Rock, Uncle Sam's Devil's Island. America's Worst, Al Capone, Machine Gun Kelly, and Whitey Bulger all called The Rock home. The island lies within sight of shore, but escape is almost impossible. Prisoners who tried were met with some of the bay's most powerful forces. The island of Alcatraz sits alone in the middle of San Francisco Bay. Within this dramatic landscape, Alcatraz and the remnants of the renowned U.S. federal prison are just over a mile from the heart of the city. For 29 years, it held some of the most dangerous and notorious criminals in history. Officially, no one successfully escaped the rock. But why exactly was no inmate able to break out of Alcatraz? Today, the island is a museum run by the National Park Service. Over 1 million people visit every year. One man has watched it rise to become one of America's most visited attractions. Ranger John Cantwell. He's worked on the island for over 25 years.
Where I'm standing is on Broadway. This is the main corridor in the cell house. Alcatraz being a supermax penitentiary meant that you had high security, 1 officer for every 3 convicts. They were constantly being watched. 12 times a day they would have counted every convict in this penitentiary building.
But its true strength as a prison can't be explained just by the thickness of its walls or the vigilance of its guards. The waters around the rock were also a deadly barrier to escape. Now, science can explain just how and why the bay was so dangerous. Draining the San Francisco Bay reveals Alcatraz as a pinnacle of bedrock emerging from the seafloor. It's surrounded by mountain peaks. All of them are ancient survivors from an age of earthquakes. Tom Parsons is a geophysicist with the United States Geological Survey. He's studied this area for decades.
So we're standing at the Golden Gate, and we're standing on mountains that were formed 100 million years ago. And we're sandwiched right between the San Andreas and the parallel Hayward Fault, both of which are helping to accommodate plate motion here between the Pacific and North American plates.
San Francisco sits right on the edge of the North American plate. As the Pacific plate grinds north past it, stress builds up along the major fault lines in the area. The Hayward Fault, and most notably, the San Andreas.
This region is very volatile. It produces large earthquakes. We've seen them in 1906, 1868. Both were devastating earthquakes in San Francisco.
The nightmarish effects of the 1906 earthquake, 7.9 on the Richter scale, are a reminder of how the area's violent geology threatens the existence of a great city. Over 100 million years ago, the landscape here was entirely different. There was a third plate between the 2 larger ones called the Farallon.
The Farallon plate used to sit between the Pacific and North American plate. It was shoved underneath the North American plate over all that time.
The movement of the Farallon plate was the catalyst that created San Francisco Bay and Alcatraz as it ground under the North American plate. This process is called subduction. As the Farallon plate disappeared, fragments of the Earth's crust were forced upwards, creating a valley and mountains.
The Alcatraz was part of the Coast Range belt that was uplifted by the subduction of the Farallon plate.
The Bay Area was then a long forested valley with a number of rocky mountains. One of these mountains was Alcatraz. 10,000 years ago, as the last ice age came to an end, the area was deluged by billions of gallons of meltwater. This created what we call San Francisco Bay. Alcatraz became an island. This 1853 photograph shows the tip of the drowned mountain as a featureless rock in the middle of the bay. Alcatraz may look tranquil and isolated, but it's surrounded by powerful natural forces. What earned the island its deadly reputation? And what may have happened during attempted escapes? Over 3 decades, there were 14 daring escape attempts from the island. The story of one of these is legendary.
Probably the most famous escape attempt would be the 1962 breakout.
Frank Lee Morris and brothers Charles and John Anglin devised an audacious bid for freedom.
The escape attempt was incredibly ingenious. It involved stealing an immense amount of material, dozens of rubber raincoats, glue, electric motors to turn into drills. The guys even made a periscope. They made a flashlight.
Now they had to use these homemade tools to breach the prison walls.
Burn 'em! We're in one of the Anglin brothers' cells, and they were ingenious to actually create a portal at the back of their cell, and they fashioned a drill made out of a vacuum cleaner engine, put a diamond bit on the end of this thing, and then poked holes through the concrete to loosen up the concrete around the air vent. Dummy heads were made out of concrete material, human hair glued onto the heads, and the faces painted on these heads. And at night, with the lights down, it looked like they were sleeping in their cells. So in the cell house, the lights go out at 9:30. That's basically when they make their break. Once the lights are out, the heads are in place, they go up to the rooftop, and they've got from 9:30 to 6:30 the next morning to make it to the mainland.
With over 50 rubber raincoats glued together, Alcatraz escapees Frank Lee Morris and the Anglin brothers made a makeshift raft and life vests. It was their lifeline to freedom. They carried everything to the roof and dragged it down to the water's edge.
So this is the actual spot where they entered the water. Frank Lee Morris and the Anglin brothers came down this hillside. They dragged their raft, inflated it at the seawall here, jumped in, and took off into the night. They searched the waters looking for these three men, and the raft or the men were never found.
The official FBI documents state the three men and their raft were most likely swept out to sea. Their bodies were never recovered. But is this what really happened? Were they lost at sea? Or could they have made it to the mainland? To understand the fate of the three escapees on their raft, scientists are studying the geology of the bay itself. Can the seabed offer an answer? First, Patrick Barnard from the United States Geological Survey explores the underwater landscape at the mouth of San Francisco Bay. He's hoping analysis of the seabed will explain the powerful currents that surge around Alcatraz, making escape attempts so dangerous.
Today we're going to be mapping from the Golden Gate Bridge west toward the outer coast.
The investigation begins under the most iconic location in San Francisco Bay. Draining the water from under the Golden Gate Bridge reveals a huge gorge. It's far deeper than the rest of the bay, large enough to hide a 30-story building. But what happens to the seabed when the multi-beam vessel heads west to the open ocean? As the boat moves farther from the bridge, the water grows much shallower. The sonar readings suggest a dramatic transformation in the seascape below.
The bottom is changing. We're seeing a lot more sediment on the seafloor now.
Draining the water reveals an incredible sight.
We're starting to see some very large sand waves here that are emerging from the depths of the Golden Gate Strait.
These formations on the seabed are huge.
So the largest sand waves are about 200 meters long, 6 meters high. The biggest ones 10 meters high or about 3 stories.
And they're sitting just yards away from the harbor entrance.
They look like probably what the Sahara would look like if you were walking through it.
These giant sand waves are caused by the huge tidal rush through the Golden Gate Strait. The fast-moving water picks up sand and then dumps it as it slows down.
You have all this sand and gravel being carried along and forced through this narrow opening, and then as the opening widens further and further, all this material gets deposited in these bed forms.
The drained landscape shows how the geology of the seabed shapes the powerful tidal currents in San Francisco Bay. First, the deep gorge funnels the water into a jet stream. Moving west, beyond the bridge, we follow the seabed as it rises from over 300 feet deep to just 130 feet. The drain shows how the racing current dumps thousands of tons of sand, creating these giant sand waves up to 30 feet high. But what does this underwater landscape have to do with escaping from Alcatraz? These racing tides are what the inmates had to contend with when fleeing the rock. Is it possible that Frank Morris and the Anglin brothers got caught in these wicked currents? The records from the 1962 FBI investigation show the tide charts on June 11th. From 9 p.m. to 3 a.m., there was a strong outgoing tide, which peaked at exactly 11:46 p.m. So when did the three escapees hit the water in their homemade raft?
From the moment lights out happened, which I think was 9:30, as soon as they could have, they would have gotten out of their cells. Give it an hour, hour and a half to have gotten everything that they needed to through that vent on the roof, cross the cell house, down the other side, hit the water. I think that they started paddling as soon as they got to the water, let's say 11 o'clock.
The three convicts would have been in the water at peak tidal flow during an ebbing, outgoing tide. What were their chances if their flimsy raft made of raincoats broke up, leaving them to swim in the powerful currents?
If you tried to escape off the north end of the island, especially during ebbing tide, like they did in 1962, where the currents are extremely strong and moving straight out to sea, it would be very difficult to swim out of that current. Within an hour and a half, you could have been on the open coast.
So Morris and the Anglin brothers had to struggle with the fastest and deadliest current flow in the bay. What happened to them is one of the great Alcatraz mysteries. Since the 1962 escape from Alcatraz, there have been wildly different rumors about the men's fate. Some claim to have seen the three men on the mainland. But this conflicts with the official FBI report into the escape, which states that their objective was Angel Island, a 2-mile paddle north of Alcatraz.
They did what nobody else ever did. They got off the island with a head start and were never seen again.
The official Bureau of Prisons report on these three men in the raft is that the raft took on water. The men were in the San Francisco Bay. They became hypothermic, and the currents took them out to the Pacific.
But this was never proved. And when the story broke around the world, there was excitement and intrigue.
It appears to be the first successful escape in the history of the maximum security prison.
For weeks, the FBI searched the bay. Their goal was to find them, dead or alive.
The escape triggered the greatest manhunt in San Francisco's history.
Though they never discovered any trace of the bodies, the FBI did find evidence of the escape.
They recovered 2 of the inflatable life vests. They recovered 2 of the plywood paddles found floating in different places in the bay. Another one of the life vests was recovered outside the Golden Gate at a beach north of the Golden Gate. There was no lack of evidence that they escaped.
Draining San Francisco Bay reveals how powerful currents on the surface that swept men to their deaths are shaped by the contours below. But for the 3 inmates, if they did reach the open ocean, there was one more deadly challenge. Because of its high population of great white sharks, this area is known as the Red Triangle.
In June of '62, it would have also been during upwelling season like it is now, so you have lots of nutrients in the water column, lots of fish and lots of bigger predators, so it's likely there could have been more great whites in the area than there are during the rest of the year.
So if they made it this far out, dead or alive, they may have become prey for the great whites. The bodies of the 3 inmates were never found. The infamous prison closed its doors in 1963 with a perfect record. Officially, there were no successful escapes from Alcatraz, though many tried.
The conditions surrounding this island is what really made it an escape-proof prison.
The bay was the most formidable of the prison's walls. You could say that the bay has really created Alcatraz's reputation.
The perfect prison was the result of extraordinary geology. Deep gorges, giant underwater sand dunes, hard bedrock pillars at the Golden Gate Strait, powerful currents, and even great predators that roamed the waters outside the bay. All natural phenomena that made the rock inescapable. But there is another mighty natural force at work in San Francisco Bay that dwarfs even the power of the ocean currents. A drained Pacific Ocean reveals the first clue. Deep under the waters off the coast of San Francisco lies the infamous San Andreas Fault. The shifting tectonic plates have caused major earthquakes in the past, the most deadly in 1906. Over 3,000 people lost their lives. But could an even deadlier earthquake hit the area? The so-called big one.
So in our forecast, we actually consider an earthquake that could start at the southernmost part of the San Andreas Fault, run all the way along through the Bay Area up north, involves the entire San Andreas Fault zone. That earthquake would be on the scale of 8.2 to 8.4 in magnitude.
The devastation would be far greater than the destruction caused by the 1989 quake.
If we were to see an earthquake of that scale in San Francisco, it would cause, unfortunately, a lot of casualties. Many buildings would collapse. Freeways and infrastructure type things would be endangered. If it did happen, I think we would see significant destruction in the city and throughout the Bay Area, throughout California.
The massive earthquake could cause parts of the city to topple into the sea. Much of the downtown core destroyed. The Golden Gate Bridge pushed to its engineering limits. But when the fire and smoke clears, one place will still be standing.
During a big earthquake, Alcatraz would be a safe haven because it is built out of very strong rock. It's not going to collapse under strong shaking like soft soil would. It's been there for 100 million years. It's hung in there, and so it's going to do well under an earthquake.
If the geologists are correct, and when the San Andreas lets go, Alcatraz is the safest place to be, that is the ultimate irony. The island that so many men wanted to get away from is the place that's going to offer the refuge.
By draining Alcatraz and exposing the secrets hidden on the seabed, a different picture of the island emerges. The explanations behind its most legendary mysteries involve more than just the prison itself. The geography of San Francisco Bay, the waters, the rocks, the wind, and the fog, a tightly woven net making Alcatraz an inescapable place, unless the big one hits. Draining the waters around Port Royal and Alcatraz Island revealed deep, powerful geological forces at work.